We will build a translation service application. It will be a web-based tool designed to translate text into multiple languages. For our backend, we'll use FastAPI. We'll have a database in Postgres, and for the translation, we'll communicate with OpenAI's GPT-4 model. This is what the end result will be. The user can input the desired text for the translation here, and also insert any number of languages that they want their text translated to. They can hit translate, and this will execute a post request to our API service, and FastAPI will then try to communicate with ChatGPT to provide the translation. Whilst this is happening, we want to inform the user that we have received their request, so it will return a 200 whilst it's asynchronously processing the translation and waiting for that to come back. So once the results have landed back onto our FastAPI app, we want to display them dynamically without the user having to click anything. So we'll be building this event-driven architecture, and this is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of the video. We also added a search functionality here, which will allow the user to query the database and check the status of any particular translation order. Also, by querying the ID, they'll be able to check the content. So they can historically browse through any of the previous translations. So this is what the project structure will look like. And it's pretty straightforward. So this is our web app. So it's our FastAPI. FastAPI utilizing conventional file structure. This will be our front end, and Alembic will handle all the database migrations. This will be our configuration files, and because in the end, we'll also create a Docker image for easy deployment. So we are moving to our VS Code now, and we will start coding the project. So you want to create your main folder, and inside you want to create another subfolder. We'll call it app. Inside of that folder, you want to create your main py, and this will be our FastAPI client. Now we will make sure that we have our virtual environment running. Let me zoom in a bit here. You want to make sure that you're in your main folder, and we will create a new environment. Once this is completed, you want to activate this environment so we can install our dependencies. So I'm going to use PowerShell for that. So you want to navigate into your environment, scripts, and I believe here should be your activate.ps1. And once you see this prefix, it means you have activated your virtual environment. So now we can install our dependencies that we'll be using for this project. So for that, we'll create a requirements text file. And I'm just going to copy everything that I know we need here. Keep in mind, very important, we have to use a specific version of OpenAI for this to work. So it has to be OpenAI 0.28.0. We also need Alembic, and now we can install all of the dependencies. So you want to navigate back to your main working directory, and you can type in pip install r requirements.txt. Once this is completed, I came back too quick. Oh, it wasn't saved. So you want to type in pip install all requirements, and once this is completed, we can start writing the code. So it might take a minute. We can start writing something in our main.py file. From FastAPI, import FastAPI. This is something we'll use later on, but you might as well do it now. Background tasks, HTTP exception, request, and depends. We'll also import HTML responses. We will import course middleware. And to be able to render an HTML page, we will import Ginger2 templates. With that being said, we'll say that FastAPI is in our app variable, and we can create a templates folder inside of this app folder. So you want to make sure that you're in the right place. Go see the app. Make sure that you're there. Type in pwd, which stands for print working directory. You want to see that you are in app, and then type in make directory templates. Inside of the templates, we'll create our index.html file. And for now, we can just put in an exclamation mark to generate an automatic HTML file, and we'll just say hello. So we can test that our app is running and rendering a page. So we want to define our first endpoint. To do that, we'll start with the get decorator, and we'll call our first path index, and the response class will be HTML response. Call the function index, and you can take in a request, which is going for the request FastAPI library, and it will return the rendered version of the index.html file. So we'll say return templates, template response. So template response, and we want to name our file that we want rendered, and we'll give it the request to be the request that was passed on to our main function here. So you can see that it's showing me this error template is not defined. So we need to make sure our FastAPI app knows where to find this file. So we will have to set this up, set up for two templates. So we will say that our templates is, and then we will give it the directory file path, and that will be templates. So this now is looking for the templates folder which we have just created. So typo there, we need a colon. So if we run this now, we should be able to see our index.html file on a local host. So if you go to your terminal and you make sure that you're in your app folder and you type in uvicorn main :app reload. We didn't save. Restarting, and we can see that it's running. If we go to the browser and we type in localhost, give it port 8000 and index, we can see this is what our index.html file has. So if I was to save this, put all these exclamation marks, refresh this, you can see that it gets updated. So this means our FastAPI web server is running. So we will go back to our index.html file and start writing some front-end code to create the basic structure of this web app. So this is our translation service. That'll be the title. We can delete this. And I'm going to add a Bootstrap link in the head segment. So you want to do the same. Just have this copy pasted. Other than looking at the video and having to type all of this in the link, just go to my GitHub. The link will be in the description, and on index.html file, you can just find this particular link and copy paste it. And you should do the same for the style as well. So we're not going to explain the basics of CSS in this video. This video is more about API integration, especially with the new services like the ChatGPT's API. And it's pretty self-explanatory. If you just read through it, you will immediately know what everything does here. So we're just defining some of these aesthetic properties for our HTML elements that we will build right now. So we will create some kind of a navbar at the top. These will be the properties, and we can add some kind of a text where we say that with the class navbar, and the top of it will be translation service. This can be anything you want, really. So next, we'll open a new container, and inside of this div, we'll open a form. So this is where the important part in regards to the front end comes. Starting our form that we'll submit to our FastAPI for translation. So we'll give label here to be for text to translate. So this later on, we'll write our JavaScript functions within this one index.html file that will do all the front end processing towards the backend, the FastAPI. So that's, in my opinion, another positive aspect of this project, that you will actually write some backend with Python and still touch upon the front-end aspects written in JavaScript as well. There's no need for that there. And we'll type in that this is the text to translate. In this, and we'll close the label. And this will be the text area. And we'll give it a class form control. And we'll give it the ID text to translate. So you can have 4 rows, and we'll give it this placeholder and close the tag. So just make sure you close this text area tag after giving it the placeholder to be end the text here. Close the tag, we move on. We want to close this div. No, not the form yet, just the div. We can copy paste this and just slightly modify it to now include the input for the languages that the user wants the translation for. So it's again form group. Oh, I forgot to put that on the top as well. Just a second, we don't want to move on without including that. So you want to go back above this translation form, and in here we will give the form ID. That's a double one. So just this line was missing. We are opening a form group here. So we're doing that again now to include the languages input. And after you finish with the placeholder, you can close the tag and close the div. And underneath of this, there'll be a submit button. So it's just a button type button, but the important aspect now is to just identify at this point that the on click for this button will be a JavaScript function that we will write pretty soon. So that'll be at the bottom of our file here. And this is our form. So we can close the form here. Just make that consistent there. So now we want to write the HTML element for displaying the translation results. So we'll create some space here for readability. So this particular div will be the HTML element that displays the results. Make sure that you have the ID in this particular syntax here. So pre-ID translation results. This will be important for the event architecture. Make sure that div is closed, and we're starting a new div. So this will be the progress container. So as we said earlier, we want to make sure that the process of translation and display for the user is being transparent towards the user. So in case they have a very long file that they want to translate, they'll have to wait for it. We want to make sure that the user is aware that that request has been accepted. It's in progress. So this particular div will be a display function for that, and it will include some kind of a visual representation of the progress bar. And now we want to include our search functionality. But before that, let's see how this raw HTML file looks. So if we go back to our browser and refresh this, it looks a bit messy at the moment. This will all fall into place as we build rest of the HTML elements, but we can see that this is a part of the nav bar at the moment. We didn't close the main div that we opened, so everything is being chucked into a single div at the moment. That'll be sorted in a minute, but we can see that everything else is in place. So we'll just continue with our work. So now we want the search functionality. So we will open a new div here and add the text of check translation by ID. So we want to be able to query the database and then return the status. So keep in mind, in my opinion, the only important thing to really take away from this is that inside of this particular input or the form, it will be interacting with our JavaScript. So the on-click functions for our buttons are very important. And this is why we write here on-click equals, and then these two particular functions that we'll write at the bottom of the page right now. So make sure that div is closed, and we'll open a new div, and this will be the translation status. So we want to display the actual text from the database that the translation is still in progress or if it's completed. And then finally, we want to display if user clicks this button, so the second button, which we'll call the function that queries the database for the content of the translation, this will be the div that will display it. So when it comes to our HTML elements, that's it. We just now need to write the functions, the JavaScript functions, and we have pretty much completed our front end. So we will open a script tag here, and this is where our JavaScript will go. Before that, make sure you get the links for the Bootstrap that we're using for this front end. So once again, it's important that you don't just try to type what you're about to see by looking this video. Rather, go to my GitHub, the first link you'll see in the description, and locate this file. You will see then at this particular line, there will be this. We can align that back. So make sure that you copy paste this from the actual file, rather than trying to write it. But by all means, if you feel like it, you can just retype it from the video. So now we want to start writing our JavaScript. Before we type some JavaScript, let's see how does the updated front end look now. So if we go back to our browser and we refresh, this still looks like a mess. So we want to go back and make sure we find where I made a mistake and fix it. So going back to our code, this was our CSS, move on. So as I said, we haven't closed one of the elements, so everything got bundled. I briefly talked about it, but forgot to type the text. So we'll close the navbar here and go back to our browser and see. Yep, there we go. So this is our front end finished now. And as you can see, input for the users are here, the translate button is here, and everything then will be displayed underneath the translate button. So now we can write the logic in JavaScript that will take this data. So if I want to translate, this is what I want to translate. And in here, I type in English. So it's already in English, German and French. If I click the button, I want the translation to appear here once it's done. But keep in mind, in case the text is long, and we will test that version as well, where we are trying to translate a huge amount of text and it will take time. I don't want to just have nothing happening whilst I'm waiting. We don't want the user having to click anything or refresh the page manually themselves. So just to make sure, if you do search for Axios JavaScript, you'll be able to get more information about this and what it does. But as you can see, it's a promise-based HTTP client. So by using it, we'll be able to do requests. So we didn't have to install it in npm because we put this link in our script, so we are able to use it through the link of the script. So we'll go back to our code and we'll finish off the front end officially with the JavaScript functions that we need. So we will do a async function. We'll call it submit translation, and we'll give it a text variable that will extract the user's text by using getElementById, and we will give it the ID text to translate dot value. So this will grab this text, so from this HTML element, and it will store it in our text variable. So we can copy paste this, and we'll do the same to have our languages stored as an array in this variable called languages. So the different ID will be languages, like so, and we want to format this to be an array of strings. So in here you want to do dot split and a map that will trim it. So just have a look at this text and rewrite it yourself, because this is just a simple logic to do some formatting to have a comma separated array of strings for our languages choice of the user. Now I want to write some logic that will prevent the user from submitting an empty input. We don't want to query the database or just to create this unnecessary network traffic to ChatGPT if the user is submitting an empty text, empty arrays basically. So we'll say if not text, languages length be 0 and languages to have to be empty. And then we'll write just to return an alert in the browser that will say please provide both text and target language, and we can just return. So I want to implement a progress bar. If the user has to wait for a significant amount of time, it's just nice to have this more interactive experience in terms of the interface the user is working with. So we'll create this progress bar. And keep in mind, this is not just about the visual, about implementing something new and nice to see visually. We also need to write our own logic that will synchronize the progress bar with the actual backend process. So this is where Axios comes in so handy, and we'll make sure that these events happen in the same time, in real time for the user. We'll create some space here, and we'll define our progress bar, and we'll say that this is a document. You can get it by ID. The ID will be progress bar, and we'll do the text on the progress bar be the same, but here with the ID change it to progress text. And we want to make sure that the progress bar can get restarted if the user gives a new request. So we'll say progress bar last list and remove if it was successful, like so. And we want to add, I'll call this primary, and this will be style. We'll give it the style width, style.width to be for the style of 0%. And then we'll also have progress.text that we want displayed, and it will be text content. So this doesn't have a dot, so delete that. So progress text content, and this will say that the translation is in progress. So now we'll write the Axios function that will execute the post request with the payload. So we will say try, this will be the const response, and it will await post, and here will be the link of our endpoint, which we still haven't built that. So this will be what we'll do on our FastAPI file. So we will call this endpoint translate. So after giving the endpoint, open the curly braces so we can give it the payload, and we'll say that the text is the variable text and the languages are the variable languages. So, oh, this is not a capital. I don't know why I did that. And we want to close this. So I made a typo here. You need to go back to where I provided the endpoint link and delete these parentheses here so that we can close them here. Hope you can see my cursor. Make sure you close them here. All right, moving on. Now we'll define the task ID to go into the response object and get the parameter of task ID. And we'll give it the alert that will say that the task ID is, and give it $sizing. It's the task ID. So the reason why we have this here, keep in mind, we said it'll be important for the user to receive a confirmation that the request that they've sent, we have received it and we are processing it. This is to cover the case where the input is large and it will take time to translate all of this and return it back to the user. So we want to instantiate some objects here. So we'll change the display. So this will be the part that dynamically changes the display. So initially in this process, at this stage, we want to set all of this to none. So feel free to either pause and rewrite this from the video or go to my GitHub and copy paste this particular bit. And then from here, we'll say that translation result is null and the progress is 0. And we will say whilst progress is 0, is less than 100, sorry. And we'll write some logic saying await a new promise, which will resolve through the timeout. And we'll set timeout at 1,000. So by the way, these are milliseconds. So this is 1 second. So 1,000 milliseconds. So with this polling technology, we want to make sure that this is constantly awaiting the response from the backend. And it will check for that every second. And then we'll say that constant result response will be the GET request. And again, we'll give it the local host, the endpoint of translate, and use this syntax to make sure that it gets the exact ID of the entry. Oh, I made a typo here, so this needs Axios. So we want to declare that our translation result then is the result response of data, and writing translation result status then being changed to completed. This will also mean that our progress has reached 100, aka 100%, or else we'll give this in the interval of 50%. So our progress bar will do increments or either 0, meaning nothing has started yet. If something is in progress, it'll be at 50%. And then the third state will be a completed state, which is 100%. So we'll say that the width of the progress bar in this case would be 50%. So now I just wanted to add some extra visual components to it. So we want to change the color to green and text according to the events that happen. So we'll target progress bar, and once it's successful, we can dynamically update the text by saying translation complete. So you want to write another document, get element by ID. This one will target translation results, and we want to stringify the data there. And we will do another document, get element by ID. This one will target the results, and we want to make sure that this display now is set at block. And we can close the curly braces and write catch error statement, and we can display this in our console. So this is just for debugging in case something goes wrong, error submitting translation, and we want to see that error so we can display it there. And we'll also give an alert in the actual browser, and we'll say an error occurred while translating. Please try again. So curly braces are closed. And now we'll use another two functions. So we want to add search functionality component. And with this, we can do this later. So we don't want to forget that. But we will have two functions. So I'm just going to open the structure for it, and we'll return to this. So this will be our check translation status. And for now, we'll give it, is there a pass? Just something that won't cause an error. And there will be another one that checks for content. So it'll be check translation content. So we will return to this later. So I believe that should be it. So all of our front end is completed, other than the last two functions where we want to add the search functionality. And we can deal with that practically at the end. So once we actually have everything up and running, we will add this ability to go through our database and historically retrieve any of the completed or not completed translations. So with that being said, we'll move on to our backend. So this is where we left off. We defined the endpoint that through a GET request renders an index.html page. So the first thing that we will do is set up our database. So you want to create these files now. You want to do database.py. You want to do models.py, create crud.py, and create schemas.py. Now a good point to discuss, how does this process actually work with the front end communicating with backend, and what are the roles of these individual files here. So if we go back to do some drawing, we'll go down here. So I'm going to create some boxes here, and we're going to say this is our front end, this will be our database, and this will be our FastAPI service. So this is our backend. So as you saw, there is a particular input that the user will give us in the front end. So this is the input. Just for the sake of this wonderful diagram, I'm going to refer to this as a payload. So instead of I, it's going to be P, which stands for payload. We already know that this payload will be text and languages. So text that they wish to be translated into these languages. So this will be our payload. We'll send this as a JSON. We have this HTML that allows the user to input this text to create this payload. And then with the Axios code that we've written to execute a post request, this post request will go to our FastAPI endpoint. So more specifically, that's the translate endpoint. Then we want our FastAPI service to first make sure that it knows what to do with this data and that it also can receive this data. So this is why we created this schemas.py. So what we're going to do in the schemas.py is to make sure that the data is validated so that it lands on our FastAPI service in a format that we can work with it. As you saw, we want to implement this search functionality by using ID. So we will then write some logic that will take the payload from this point and store it into our database. So I'm just going to mark that this payload has initially been given to the front end with a post request. This payload now has reached the backend, and then the backend gives it to a database so it can receive a unique ID. So now this payload here will have some kind of an ID. So let's just give it a random numeric value. Let's say this is now number 4, P4. So payload with an ID 4. We will have some further logic that will send the payload to ChatGPT. So this will be our external API here. So we will say OpenAPI for translation. So our FastAPI service will need some logic that does that. Once that is returned, we will have our FastAPI store it in a database. So this flow now has another line. We can say that once it reaches that place, it needs to go into the database. So initially, this part was just storing the payload and giving it. So it was ID and payload, which was text and languages. But on the second entry, as you can see, this blue line, this becomes the translated payload, and it will just be the text. And then once this event has been confirmed, there has to be some logic that will inform the front end of that data that you originally sent to me as a payload. Well, I've done what you asked of me, and it's ready for you to use. And then in that case, the backend will deliver the payload with the ID and with the translation of the text. So I'm just going to put TT, translated text. So then all of this can be displayed on our front end. So this ugly looking diagram is an explanation of this event architecture. So first things first, something that I like to get out of the way, and it's pretty much the standard for me in the development process. Keep in mind for deployment, this requires a little bit more talk based on specific circumstances of how you want to deploy your project. But for now, for this project, we want to make sure that once we do run it locally, if we want to tinker around with certain things, I don't want errors to come up. So I'm going to make course not a problem immediately by adding this middleware. So we imported that in the beginning of the tutorial, and we're going to use it like this. Not the most important aspect of this video. So we will move on. So remember, I want to have my endpoints for handling data. So we'll say app.post, and this is our main translate endpoint, and we'll give it a response class, response model, and we'll have a schema for this. So this will be the moment where we write our validations with Pydantic. So stop this for a second and open your schemas.py file. And in here you want to import Pydantic base model, and you want to get from typing list and dictionary. And we will have 3 classes. One will be translation request, and it will inherit from base model, and this will be the string of the text that the user has given us for translation, and then the list of languages. This will be a list of strings. Next is the task response. This will also inherit from base model, not base exception. And this will be the ID that we are returning to the front end as soon as the request has been made. Lastly, we have translation style, and this will also get base model and have task ID, integer, status string, and translations should be dictionary of strings. So these are our schemas, and the purpose of them will be to validate the data, to make sure that the data, before getting processed, before we assign it all sorts of work to do, is in the format of how we want it to be. So you can close your schemas.py. That's all we're going to do with that. One more thing before we deal with the rest of the schema implementation. You also want to create a file here called init. So In case then you want to have a different way of importing, for example, instead of saying here import schemas, we'll be able to import from schemas and then give it the exact names of the requests. So in order for that to work, you would need this init file. But even if you leave it just with import schemas, all of the schemas would work. That's up to you now for your preference. So we want to make sure that the incoming data, which is a part of our request variable here, so that's our payload, is validated by our translation request schema. And then what we are returning is task response schemas. So if I open a second tab here just for you to have a quick look, the incoming payload is going according to the request. So the input from the user, which is text in the language that they want translation in, and the task response will just be the ID. So all that we'll send back to the user is the ID. Keep in mind, this goes along with what we decided to do, that once the user has clicked translate this for me, what they'll receive immediately is a 200, or this is your process. It has an ID, and since it's actually processed and the bar reaches 100%, you will get a translation. So that's the reason why we have this schema order. So after we have defined our schemas, we can move this. We want to start modifying how the database will be set up and how this CRUD system operations will be done. So the pseudocode for it will look like something like defining that within our task, we will have a CRUD file that will hold all of our operations, all of our methods for doing create, read, update, delete operations. And we will call this function, we can call it create translation task. So we don't have this yet, but we will create it in a second. And this function will have certain parameters. So we can have 2 parameters, or 3 parameters, because it will also have the languages X, Y, Z, P. Then we will add it to the background tasks. And this is something that I believe is fundamentally important to understand in order to proceed. So we will go to the browser and read something about the documentation. So I just want to make sure that you know where to look for to understand this particular technology. So if you go on Google and type in FastAPI documentation, and in the search bar, you want to look for background tasks. So this is where you'll be able to find all the documentation related to this particular concept. You can use it to schedule the execution of background tasks after the response is sent. And you can pretty much see where I'm going with this. So I want to be able to have my web app process these asynchronous tasks. So by all means, if you need any further familiarization, open this particular document and you can find all the details you need there. In the meantime, now we'll go back to our code. So we want to now add, whilst we are creating the translation, so this is our create translation function, which we still have not created, we'll create it now. We are going to add to the background tasks a task. We'll do perform translation task ID and the request variables. So request text and request languages, and we'll pass the B again. And we will return, as we said, the return schema. As we said, for what we decided to return to the user would just be the ID. So now to create, we don't need this. So now to create these methods. So we want to go in our CRUD file and create this method for creating translation tasks. And then we're going to deal with our perform translation method for our background tasks. So we can copy this and we'll go into our CRUD file. And from here, you want to import SQLAlchemy at the session. And we'll import models because this is how we will fill out our tables. But we'll build the database after this. First, let's define this method. So you can copy paste the name, and this will have a connection to our database, and it will take, as we said, there are 3 parameters: database and then the payloads components. So this will be languages, which is a list. And we want to say the task is a models translation task. And languages are languages. So after that, we want to go into our DB session and use it to the base. Every time you do that, you need to do commit and refresh. So this is how SQLAlchemy, this particular ORM, handles this. This will be always a part of any CRUD operation. But I'm going to pass the task here and say return task. Then the second method we want is the method that will fetch the translation task. It will also be able to go into the database and work with the ID. That's an integer, and it will just return the query according to the ID that we pass it. So it will go translation task, and you want to pass this. So models translation task ID. So find the models that has the ID same as the ID that we passed in this parameter and return the first batch. And then the last thing we want in our CRUD operations methods will be to update the translation task. So once again, this part will be the same. So I can copy paste this from above. But this now returns the translations as well. So if you remember when we actually had our diagram, I'm going to pull it up so you can see exactly where, in this method, where they appear on our diagram. So take it in mental memory for now. This is method number 1 and this is method number 2. So if you remember our not so good looking diagram here, when we were talking about the backend processing this particular payload. So the method number 1 is the payload that has the text and the languages as a parameter. So they will still share the same ID. The red text here and the blue text here representing two different aspects that work within the same table. So this is all one table, but on two different instances we are doing a either create or update request to it. So in the red one, which corresponds to our, when I said red, I'm referring to this line here. It corresponds with our first method here, create translation task. And this line, so this particular sequence of event here is just updating the translation. So adding the translation. So that's the update. And it needs the ID parameter to know where to add that translation to because it's returning after. So these are two separate events that are operating in the same table. So as you can see, we need to pass task ID so that it knows how to find the table where it will chuck in the translation of this text here from the first function and in the languages of the first function. So I hope that's clear, and that's quite important to understand for this particular type of system. So we'll say that the task, it can go and find according to the ID. So it will filter models and it will be the same way of querying like the one above. And then we want to say it equals translations, and the status now changes to completed. And again, after every CRUD operation, you want to do commit and refresh and return task. And that's it for our CRUD operations. We won't have to open this anymore, I believe. Now we want to create our database. So we're going to talk about how to set up this database and create our table. So first you want to go into your database.py. In here you want to import OS, you want to import create engine from SQLAlchemy session maker, and in order to keep our variables safe, the ones that contain sensitive data, that's important here, you want to import .env, load.env. So we will load this .env, and what this means, so what that means, you want to go in the main directory. So if you go print working directory inside here, so you want to make sure you are in your main working directory, so outside of the main app folder, and we will do touch.env. And in this file, we will have our database URL and we will have our OpenAI key. So for now, you can leave this empty, but this will be the file that will hold your sensitive information, and then we're going to load this file with our dependency here, .env. So that will allow us to say OS using the import OS library, get env, and then particular variable called database URL, which you can see corresponds with this here. So this is the way you keep it safe. Then below that, you want to say that the engine is create engine, and we will pass it the parameter of the previously defined connection string sensitive information that we stored in our .env file. So it travels all the way through this in such manner. And lastly, we want to add the session maker. I'm not sure does this have to be here, but for now, let it remain. I doubt that it can hurt. So that's all we need for our database.py. We'll move on to our models.py, where we will be defining our table. So you want to import these from SQLAlchemy. So column, integer, string, text, and JSON. Those will help us create different types of data types in our database. And then after that, you want to get declarative base from this particular dependency, also SQLAlchemy. So here we will call base declarative base, and now we will create our table. So we'll say that the translation task creates a table called translation tasks, and now we will actually define all the rows. So we'll say that the ID is a column, which will be an integer and a primary key. true. And we'll have text, which is type text, nullable false. So it can't be empty. And we'll do that for languages. But languages are a list, so that will be a JSON here. And there will be status, which is a column string, and the default is in progress. So if you remember, we only had to, in our CRUD file, we only had to have an alternative of can be changed to completed now, because here we can set the default to be in progress. And then we are adding the translations finally. That's a JSON, and the default is just an empty JSON. And that's our models PY. I don't think we will need to go back to this, but I'll still leave this open because I might have to talk about it a bit later. So now we can go to our main.py and write a cleaner version of this. So you want to go to the top and import the CRUD file. And now this function actually exists. We just created it, so we can pass the genuine parameters. So this will be the database, this will be the text parameter of the request, and this will be the languages parameter of the request. So the only thing missing within these parameters is our DB. So you will go here above the course, and we will define this function. Actually, we can define this in our database file. So we can say get DB. I'm sure you can copy paste this just from the FastAPI documentation, but I have it here in front of me as well. So we can say try yield this DB. So this now turns into a generator, DB close. And then we will import this. So if we go back to main py, we can say from database import. Now we should be able to use this. If we say DB. So now moving on to our background tasks. So for this, we'll have to write some utility functions. So these are the functions that we want to give to our background tasks process to handle asynchronously. Oh, we want to make sure that this is called the same. Here is getDB. So we want to create a new file here. We'll call it utils.py. And what we're going to do now is create this function that will perform the translation. But before that, there is one thing that I forgot. We want to make sure that a database is created. So if you go here above app, you want to paste this part. So you want to say models.base metadata, create all, and then bind the engine. And we will import models. And also from database, we want to import the engine. So now, once we start the main file, each time our FastAPI loads up the server, it will make sure that a certain database exists and that a table that's defined in our models exists. If it doesn't, it's going to create it. So next thing we'll do is create our database in pgadmin4. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by showing you how to download PG and admin4 from internet. Just Google it, download it, configure it. You will get a username and a password once you configure it, and then you will see in your server cluster, you can create a database by clicking right click on databases, create database, and give it a name. So I'm going to give it the name translation service. You'll just click save, and that's it. You have your database. If you go under schemas and tables, if you click refresh here, you'll see that there are no tables, which is good. We will create that from Python. And this is the beauty of using an ORM, which is SQLAlchemy in this case. So what we have to do is define it here, and this particular table name with this name will be created once we load our server. So in order now to connect your database to this particular project, you want to go in your .env, and your username and password will go here. This is the address, and this is the name of the database. So once again, here you're defining what SQL. Here you are giving the username. This is the password. This is the address, and obviously we are working locally, so this is localhost. If you're deploying this project, these will be credentials of your actual provider. And then the translation service is the database. So this is the database name over there. So this is pretty self-explanatory. I have no doubts that you can configure this successfully. Once you have done that, you will go back to your VS Code. We can delete this. And now we are ready to launch our server, and this should automatically create our table as well. So if you go in the main folder and run this line, one thing before I move on, we need to also make sure that we install this. So I've added it in our requirements.txt, but if you need to individually install it, do pip install this particular library, the last one here. So after you've done that, you go in your terminal, working directory, and you run recall main app reload. So everything is running. And now if you go back to your pgadmin4 and refresh the tables, you will see that the translation tasks table has appeared. So now we know that our database is connected, our server is running, and we can finish the backend by writing the utility functions. So just to remind you of where we are, if you go into your main.py, you'll remember that when we were writing our endpoint, we defined this background tasks process, and the task that we added was supposed to be a function called perform translation. So now we're going to actually write that function, that method in our utility.py. So here you want to import OpenAI. From SQLAlchemy ORM, you want to import session to be able to connect to the database. From our CRUD file, you want to import the update translation task. And from our environment, you want to import load function and also OS. Here we will pass the API key for our OpenAI. We'll use OS to fetch the environment. And we'll say that this variable is called OpenAI API key. To make sure this is connected, you have to go in your .env file and you have to put in an API key in a variable called OpenAPI key, like such. I'm going to do that off screen. So you just copy paste your OpenAPI key here or any other LLM you want to use, but I'll be using OpenAPI. So once you do that, you click save and we move on. So when you finish setting up your environment for sensitive data, we can write our function. So we'll say that perform translation takes parameter of task ID. So the integer and the text is string and languages will be a list. And we also want to get DB session. We'll say that translations are an empty dictionary and write a for loops saying for each element in the languages list, try giving in the response OpenAI chat completion and create. Model will be GPT-4 and the messages will be a list, an F string that says this, or a helpful assistant that translates text into and then the language of each language. That'll work. And underneath that, we'll do role, the user content, and then the text. You give a comma here, and we'll say that the max tokens are 1,000, but you can adjust this based on your own needs. So then we will get the translated text, and we'll give it in the response. So that's a 0, and here we'll write some formatting, because we're dealing with a list. And we'll give our translations, then, of each language to be translated text. And we want to do some debugging as well. Oh, in the meantime, I forgot. You want to go above and load the environment variable. And here I made a typo, so this is max tokens like such. And now we will write this exception. So our exception will print that if there was an error, we will get the error back so we can see. And we can play around with this if we end up actually having some errors. But for now, we'll just leave it as such. And now we want to call this function the update translation task. So if you click on the update translation task and click F12, it will take you back to your CRUD file. So you can remind yourself of what this actually does. So we have already written this function. We are just invoking it here now to perform that task. So we will say update translation task. It will have a parameter of DB to connect to the database and then update the database by finding the particular ID and inserting the translations into the table. So we save this and we just now need to finish our endpoints and that'll be the end of our backend. So I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. We'll take the core stuff and just put it above our endpoints. So I forgot to pass the background tasks as a parameter. So in our translate function here, we want to add the background tasks. So I've inserted here between the schemas and the DB session. So add the to be background tasks with a capital B. And then we want to add the connection to the database. So we will say that variable DB is session depends get DB. And then we don't need this get DB variable. So in this line 43, delete get DB and do the same for this line 42 in task. First thing after parentheses, delete this as well. And now we need to import session. So if you go on top and we do from SQLAlchemy import session. And that's SQLAlchemy.orm import session. So we will now write the utility functions for our search functionality. And this will be fairly similar. So it will be a get request. So I copied the previous endpoint. I'm just going to modify it. So this one will go this GET request will have a task ID parameter, and the schema is not going to be task response. Delete that and put translation status. Delete all of these parameters other than DB. And here we will pass in task ID to be an integer and then just have the connection with the database. Here in the task, we'll go into our CRUD file and we will get, I feel like there's a typo here, but we can still get the exact text. So get the translating task, DB task ID. This line of code we can delete, and underneath the task, we'll say if nothing returns in task, or better said, if task returns empty. So if task is null, we want to raise an exception. So we'll put in HTTP exception and we'll give it a status code of 404 with the detail of task not found. But if task is not null, then we want to return task ID and the status, which is the task.status. So it will access that parameter and return entry from the database. And the translation will be the variable translation. So again, we'll access the task translations. And then we want to do practically the same thing, but for content. So this particular endpoint will correspond to, let me show you exactly what. So it will correspond exactly to check status button. And then now we're going to write the function that will be an endpoint that gets executed once we click check content. So we can copy this and we'll slightly modify it. We can change the endpoint address. So we'll say that this is content/task ID. And I forgot one thing. We want to change the name. So it goes back to the previous function. For me, that's line 60. And here we will just say get translate because they have to be called differently. The first one is called translate. The second one then should be called get translate. And the third one can be called get translate content. Something like that. As long as they have unique names, it's fine. And this will remain all the same. The task line will also remain the same. And this will remain same as well. But when we return, we do not need to return the ID. We just want to return the task altogether. And that should be it. So I believe this is all we need for our backend to work. But now we can go and try running this. So if we save and give it a first test. So we put some text here. We will say, hello there, how are you? And we will say that we want to translate this to French, German, and Italian. And we will click translate. And we get error. Please provide both text and target language. So this means there is some kind of a problem with the logic that's supposed to confirm that there actually is content here. So to troubleshoot this, I'm going to start from the beginning. I need to check what's wrong with this button. Is this button actually picking up, extracting the data from here? So let's try opening the developer resources. We'll go into console. In the console, I want to be able to see. So if I do a console log or something, I want to be able to see a particular result. Let me see, can I zoom in on this, make it a bit larger? That should work for now at least. Allow pasting. That's too much of text. So we'll say that constant text, and we want to get element by this particular text. So now if I do console log text, and I can see that it does extract the text from here. So that's not an issue. And if I do constant languages, and the ID for this are languages, and I do value, and we put in languages here, I get this. So that's not an issue. Next, I want to make sure that this button actually does what it's supposed to. So what I'm going to try to do is go to my HTML file and find the code for the button. So if we go into our app and we'll open templates, HTML, and we want to find a line that declares the button for submit. So in our line 46, on click is submit translation. If I do an F12 on this, it takes me to my function. This is the code that we tested, so we know that code worked. So the console logging that we just did in the console. And I think I can see a typo here. So after this, we need these two. So I believe I just omissed these particular bit of characters. So I've saved that. We are rerunning our server and let's try it again. And then I realized I made a silly typo with response.openai. It should be response equals. I'll go to network. And I want to see what happens when I try to make this request, and I can see nothing happens. So all of the GET requests here are fine. But if I do hello to German and I want to do this, nothing happens. So my first idea how to troubleshoot this, I just want to make sure that all of the backend now works properly. So I'm going to use Postman to just quickly test the backend. So if you go into Postman and you provide the endpoint address, so that's our 8000 ports / translate, and we give it this particular payload and we click send, we get 422 unprocessable entity. So there is an error with our backend. So we're just catching some errors. I realized that I forgot to pass the variable for the API key. So if you go into your utils.py, underneath this, we want to make sure that we have given the API key properly. So make sure this particular line, the line number 10, is present. Also, I made an error here. So indentation error, this function should be outside of this particular except. So it is outside of this for loop. So make sure you align it with the for loop. All right, we'll continue troubleshooting. We'll make sure that languages is written properly. So I misspelled it here. It's written atrociously. So make sure you fix that too. If you go back to the models.py and instead of that was written languages here, make sure that this is written correctly. So now, in order to update this, unfortunately, this ORM, SQLAlchemy, cannot do migrations dynamically like this. So we'll have to go to our Postgres database in pgadmin4 and manually delete the tables and restart everything. So we will go to translation tasks, delete, click OK. Now when we go back to our server and click save, it should create a new one. So if we refresh, we see translation tasks, and I want to open it to make sure that in my columns the languages is written correctly now, and as you can see it is. So to double check, triple check actually, from schemas to the main py, we want to make sure that every time we have languages it's written correctly, there are no typos or nothing like that. And after that I need to check how did I write the names of the methods in case I misspelled when re-referencing them in other places. So I'm going to open main.py and utils and crud next to each other, and then we'll make sure that all of them are named the way they should be. So in our utils, this is perform translation, that's fine. But then in our main.py, we want to make sure that in our first function that we are calling create translation task. And if we click on it and press F12, it will lead us to a CRUD operation, so that's fine. In our second use method, this is supposed to lead to the second CRUD operation, and that's fine as well. So you want to make sure that these are aligned, and the third one should lead to, again, the second CRUD operation as well. So if that's all correct, let's try running the server and see are there any further bugs that we need to fix. So we are running the FastAPI server again. So it looks like it is online. Let's check what happens when we try to send a request. So I've tried sending this and we got an error which says that there was an error translating to French and German. So this means that we did get payload delivered to our FastAPI web service, but the follow-up with our background tasks did not manage to get a return from our translation service. So now we know where to go and troubleshoot. How silly of me, I forgot that we left two functions untouched and we need to finish them. My plan was to do it at the end, but I did end up forgetting to do them all together. So let's go back to our front end and make sure that we have those functions written. So if we open our index.html, so in our first function that will check for the translation status, so that will be our first button in our search functionality. We want to add constant ID, which will be document get element by ID, and this will be the ID of search ID, and we want to get the value of that stored in table ID. So we'll do try, we'll have a constant response, which will be our Axios function that will execute a get to our local host. Let me just copy paste this particular link. So you want to do the same brackets. So this is your link. This is our endpoint on our FastAPI. After this, we're going to say that our translation result is data from response. So whatever is received from this endpoint will be stored in response, and we are accessing that data. After that, we'll be using get element by ID for translation results. So we want to get the text content of that. Are we going to stringify that? Then we want to also get element by ID with ID results, and the style display for that will be block. After, we want to display translation status. And we'll do that again by using getElementById, and we'll target the status result. And with this, the text content will change to status, give it a $, translation result status. And we'll close this. And again, we want to change this one to block. Else we want to catch an error. So we know that if we need to do debugging, we can actually see what's going on, what's gone wrong. So we'll do console error fetching translation status, and we'll print the error. So log the error, and we can give an alert that says that there was an error while fetching the translation status, and try again. So that's our first function, and then we want to have the function for the second button. So this will be the on-click for the second button on our page when we actually want to display the entire content of a particular historic entry in our database. So a translation we did before. And again, just like in the above function, we can copy paste the const ID, which will be getElementById, search ID, so exact same line like in the function above. And we're going to use the same structure of saying try and defining the response to execute a GET request. But with the previous one, endpoint was /translate ID. This one is content ID. So it corresponds exactly to this endpoint. So the first function calls a GET request to this endpoint. This one will be called by our second function that we are writing right now. So again, we want to stringify this. And with the second element, we want to change the style to block. So I'm going to copy paste the code for that. And if you need to, you can pause and rewrite the code yourself or play around a bit to understand how we are accessing these elements with getElementById, typing in the actual ID of the HTML element, dot text content, and stringifying the JSON. Just realized I don't need the return for this. So if you go above to the first function, you can delete the return. Same for the second function. And we will just finish off writing the statement for our try. And we can just add catch error just as we did in the previous function. So you can copy paste this entire bit. And if we save this, we can check, do we have any bugs after this? So if you need to, feel free to pause, look at the code for these two functions. This is the final version of them. And this is all that our index.html file needs in terms of JavaScript. So feel free to pause and make sure your code is updated with all of this. So another silly typo. In our models.py, you want to add the S. So it's not translation, it's translations. We'll save that and try running everything again. And now we have the issue that comes with SQLAlchemy, just working with an ORM like SQLAlchemy. So we're not able to modify these tables dynamically. We have to delete everything effectively and then restart, recreate a new table again, and then it will be updated to this new name for the column. So if you open your pgadmin and you go into your tables, translation task, and if you delete this table, and now if you rerun the whole thing, you can go back into your tables and refresh this, and there will be a brand new translation tasks table. So if you query for the last all rows, you can see that the table is empty. So a brand new table has been created. We'll go to crud.py and make sure that all of our methods here are named grammatically correct. So you want to change the middle one. I believe it had the missing, which one was it? So it was get translating. So we can change all of that and just put get translation task for the middle one. So feel free to pause and compare this crud.py file to the current one you have. Make sure it's written exactly like you see here, and we can move on. So we need to go to our main py and make sure that just how we have everything written in crud.py, the functions are written the exact same way in our main py. So we can open them one next to another. So if we open crud on the right hand side, and we have main py on the left hand side. So let's see now. In our post request, we are using create translation task, and that's correct here. In our get endpoint for our task ID, we are using get translating task. So this is the one that we just changed. So we will copy this name, and here we'll change into get translation task. And the same thing goes for our third method here. We want to put get translation task. We'll save that. I believe we also need to go to our imports and make sure that from database we import session local next to engine. We also want to import list from typing, and we will import UUID. So just to make sure we don't get any errors in regards to that, we'll move on now. And in our third method, we deleted, so there's no need for this response model. That's not going to give translation status. So you want to do this. So after we deleted that, we also want to make sure that we return the task not as an object but as a variable here. And that was the last of our errors. I believe there was a good 5 to 10 errors that we had to fix at the end. Some of them just being typos, some of them being logical errors. And we will go and test our app now. So we want to go to our browser. We will access our endpoint for rendering the main page. And we will put some text here. Hello, how are you today? And let's say we want this in French, German, and Italian. And if we click translate, we are given an ID, so it's an ID 6. We can see the translation is in progress. We got the results, so we see now progress bar in action. Translation is complete. So now we want to maybe check. Let's first check, did this land in our database? So if we go into our PG admin and we refresh this by going into show me all rows, you can see here at the bottom that we do have the recent request, the languages, the status being complete, and we have the translations here. So what was the ID for that? It was number 6. So if we put enter translation ID 6 and check status, we see that the status is complete. If we do check content, we get the entire content of the translation request. Let's try doing something much bigger. So I'm going to just try going to a random Wikipedia page or something like that. So let's say I type in, I don't know, Vivaldi, and let's try to take a big chunk of Vivaldi's page from Wikipedia. And if we put Vivaldi's Wikipedia and request the translation into French, German, Italian, and Portuguese, so this should take considerably longer. So now we want to see this asynchronous nature of our web app in action. So this is task ID 7. So we got our confirmation that the progress has been received. And as we wanted now, we can see that asynchronously, the background tasks from FastAPI is running the second process of translating the task. And we already have our 200. So even if we go back in our VS Code, we can see that we have our get translate every 1 second going as a OK, which is what we wanted. So we are still waiting for this. We are waiting for the OpenAI API to return the translation for us. So let's see how long it takes. So it's been 2 or 3 minutes, and as you can see, we still didn't get our request back. And if I go back to my VS Code, you can see that the polling that we defined to be 1000 milliseconds, it's doing its job. Every 1 second, it's constantly refreshing and wanting to get that payload back so that it can display it to the user. Like we said, we don't want the user to have to do anything on the page. The page should dynamically update. So the translation finally came back. It took a good couple of minutes, and we can see that everything is updated on our page. If we want to check now the status of it, and we put number 7, check status, we did see that the status is complete, and same thing for content, we can retrieve it on our page. And that's it. That's our project. I hope you enjoyed it, you learned something, and I'll see you next time.